The People of the Secret. Chapter 3. The Inner Alliance, Rome, Christianity and Islam. Before we look at the impulses which radiated from 3 points in the Muslim world and led to the awakening of Europe, it will be useful to look briefly at the state of European knowledge as the Muslim conquest was developing. The Roman Empire in the West had officially come to an end in 476 when Romulus Augustulus was deposed. But for a century before this, Rome had been a capital in name only. Shortly before the Council of Nicaea in 325, Constantine had moved his seat to the Greek city of Byzantium, taking many of the treasures of Rome with him. Even at that time, Rome was only a shadow of its former glory. Athens already house, the chief schools of philosophy, Beirut the schools of law. Science was studied in Egypt and Syria. Alexandria had the great library. Though the official language of the empire was Latin, the cultural language was Greek, and it was Greek, not Latin, that became the official language of the new Byzantine Empire. Thus knowledge resided in Greek, a language which almost nobody in Western Europe could speak. Only the monks preserved Greek, and only the monasteries had, therefore, the key to pre-Christian learning. But the monasteries were almost invariably sited in inaccessible spots remote from the battlefields, and remote, therefore, from contacts which might have served to inject a revival of learning into the stream of ordinary life. Helping further to keep Europe at the level of warring tribes was the Church's deep suspicion about almost everything that derived from the pre-Christian past. There seems to have been one exception to this, the Celtic Church. The spread of Christianity throughout the Roman Empire had thrown a few isolated Christians among the Druidic Celts of Ireland, and it was to extend this nucleus that the Church sent Palladius to Ireland in 431. Though he built several churches, his mission largely failed, and the conversion of Ireland had to wait for St. Patrick. Patrick was a Romano-Briton who had been sold into slavery in Ireland. He escaped to Gaul, crossed the Channel to England, and returned home. Later, as he rose in the church hierarchy, his knowledge of Ireland and the Irish language made him an obvious choice for a missionary effort to succeed Palladius. Patrick was well received, and Celtic Christianity was probably born at the meeting between Patrick and King Logaer at Tara. The Irish reacted to the impulse of Christianity like no other nation did. They reverenced religion, but they loved life. They also respected learning. They already possessed a wisdom tradition from their own Eastern ancestry, and it had been carefully preserved in their initiate system. Their olams, or bards, were also healers, whose methods and training are astonishingly paralleled by Sufic methods in use at the present time. When the Irish accepted Christianity, they did so on their own terms, which was to deny any conflict between the love of learning and the love of God. They must, one feels, have been a sore trial to Patrick. In the work of Rodney Colin, we saw that a new cell may be born into the body of human history by the action of a conscious man, or men, on a carefully selected site. We also saw that a cell of history in decline may be reborn from a shock administered from outside the line of its own actualization. In the conversion of the Irish, we may suspect the rebirth of Celtic culture by a shock from Christianity. Once again, there was a period of incubation, then an explosive expansion. By the 6th century, Irish learning was famous, and scholars were being drawn to Ireland from the fringes of Europe. Mostly they came by the old trade route from the Loire to Cork, but some came through Britain and across the Irish Sea to Bangor. Some indication of the extent of the traffic may be gathered from the fact that in 550, an entire ship was chartered to bring scholars from Gaul to Cork. Officially, Celtic Christianity had no independent existence, but its spirit and its methods were wholly different from those of Rome. It saw no reason to reject a heritage from the past, whereas Rome could find little good to say of anything that preceded Jesus. The Irish Church preserved pagan literature because it valued knowledge. It read pagan poetry side by side with the Christian Gospels. When it copied the Gospels, its monks were inspired by more than devotion and skill, or even love of the message they were transcribing. In the Book of Kells, from a monastery in Ireland, and in the Lindisfarne Gospels, from a monastery off the Northumbrian coast, there seems to be illumination at more than manuscript level. The work suggests inner illumination, both light and joy. The Celtic Church acted as a magnet to minds that sensed something defective in the official presentation of Christianity, and the magnet caused a two-way flux from Europe to Ireland and from Ireland back to Europe. With St. Columba 521-597 and his pupil Columbanus, the missionary stream outwards began. Columba established Iona in the Western Isles of Scotland as a place whose energies are so palpable even today that they impress Roman Catholics, atheists and dropouts alike with a sense of the sublime. Columbanus founded more than 100 monasteries on the continent of Europe, an immense achievement which, for some reason, seems little noticed by either Rome or secular history. His foundations included Luxeuil, Bobbio, St. Gall, St. Bertin, Cumiages, St. Riquier and Remiremont, monasteries that reflected piety and wisdom in combination. Rome can hardly have been unaware of events, and the possible danger of a spread of learning not altogether under its control. Perhaps in the mission of Augustine to Britain in 597, there may have been a secondary briefing. When he met Celtic Church leaders from Wales, Augustine invited them to cooperate in converting the Anglo-Saxons under the auspices of Rome. The Celts refused, and the conflict of essential natures which manifested openly at this time was never resolved. It may be that from its own initiate tradition, the Celtic Church knew the significance of certain dates and held them as a matter of conscience and not of convenience. Rome insisted on her version, and at the Synod of Whitby in 664 imposed Roman orthodoxy on the Celtic Church. The independence of the Celtic Church, and perhaps the contribution it might have made to a future wholly different from the one we know, was terminated. A glimpse of the Celtic Church's activity, and perhaps its methods, a century later, may be gleaned from the writing of a monk of St. Gall. He tells how two graduates of the Irish schools accompanied merchants on a trading mission to France. Mingling with the merchants at a fair, they stood calling their wares like other traders. But what they called out was, "We have wisdom to sell." For, says the monk of St. Gall, they knew that if men get anything for nothing, they think little of it. The incident came to the ears of Charlemagne, who sought out the merchant monks and asked them the price of their wisdom. Proper places and noble souls, and such things as we cannot travel without, food and wherewith to be clothed, they told him. Charlemagne installed them at his own court, where a school was presently established, in which rich and poor sat together. Rodney Collin, tracing the sequence of cultures, describes the fate of the Celtic Church in a single sentence. It was murdered. It did not, however, die at once. That a true developmental influence lingered on within it for another 2 centuries may be deduced from the fact that Sufic Celtic traces are discernible in the 9th century. A well-known Celtic cross of the period, now in the British Museum, incorporates the Arabic formula Bismillah Rahman Rahim, suggesting that the Celts were once again in touch with an influence from a genuine psychokinetic source. We suggest that because they had retained a knowledge of genuine psychokinetic technique from their Druidic inheritance, the Celts came close to reintroducing the missing wisdom component into Christianity. The effort failed, and a second attempt had to wait for other centuries and other sites, the events which followed the expansion of the Muslim empires. We shall now make 2 suggestions, different in their degree of plausibility. The first is that initiates of high degree accompanied the Saracen armies into Spain. The second is that a large proportion of the world of today derives, largely unsuspected, from the activities of these schools of initiates which began to operate from Cordoba and Toledo in the early years of the 9th century. These schools were supported by immense efforts both of human industry and of spiritual force channeled into Spain from the east. The Moslem conquests had overrun in part or in whole the cultural areas of Byzantium, Persia, Greece and Egypt, and almost at once Arab scholars and their collaborators proceeded to collate, analyze and reissue the corpus of human knowledge which derived from all these sources. From an esoteric standpoint, the beads of Mercury had been reunited. It was an immense task, and one to which Western scholarship has given scant credit, except in highly specialized works. Helped by Nestorian Christians in Syria, the work began with the translation of ancient texts. Simultaneously, with these texts as a basis, Arab pragmatism gave rise to new and significant syntheses. One of the earliest of the great Arab scholars was al-Razi, 865–925, a man who has been rated by modern German scholars as being comparable in intellect to Galileo. Like the other medical authors of the time, he was Arab in language, Persian in origin. Razi had a greater degree of freedom from prior assumption than Orthodox Muslims, and this was echoed in his work. His medical insights were great and his mind versatile. He studied the symptoms of measles and smallpox, and interspersed treatises on gynecology and ophthalmology with books on the theory of music. He founded a hospital, and in his investigation of alchemy, provided, at exoteric level, the basis of much modern chemistry. Some of his medical works were required reading in European universities as late as the 17th century. His portrait adorns the Great Hall of the School of Medicine at the University of Paris. A little later, Avicenna, a Persian whose family came from Balkh, wrote 100 books, one of them over 1 million words long. He classified 760 drugs, including opium and cannabis. He produced treatises on heat, energy, and gravity, and suggested, 1,000 years before his time, the limiting velocity of light. Razi and Avicenna, both Persians, are only two of an enormous number of Arab scholars who provided the raw material required for the coming injection of intellect into Europe. Yet many of them are virtually unknown to the European science and philosophy which they sired. Some of their work remains untranslated to this day. Yet these scholars of the East represented only the external corpus, almost the manual workers, of the operation, which was directed from an altogether different level. That Arabic influence was leaping into Europe by the early 800 AS is shown by the remarks of one Paulus Albarus of Cordoba. He is on record as complaining that among his fellow Christian churchmen few of them knew their own tongue, that is, Latin, well enough to write so much as a letter of greeting to a brother, but that herds of them could learnedly expound the Arab pomps of language. It is difficult enough to follow the ordinary external shifts and trends of history, to trace in detail impulses which, by their very nature, are invisible at the time of their origin, and which may only be suspected from their effects, is altogether impossible. All we can hope to do, in respect of the secret aspects of the events which entered Europe at this time, is to try to note certain key individuals and certain key events more or less at random, and then see whether a common thread can be found connecting them. We shall hope to show that a common thread does connect the whole history of Europe, and that the threads lead back to Spain on the one hand, and to the Middle East on the other. For a brief period, a third thread runs south and east to Sicily. As Cordoba became stabilized as a showpiece of colonial Islam, several schools of initiates formed within it, using the external form of Islam as their cover. Some such camouflage was necessary, for the work they had to do was as incomprehensible to the zealots of Islam as it was to what was now accepted Christianity. Such agents of the great work as became partly visible were viewed with equal incomprehension and hostility by both. As the price of even relative freedom to work, the Sufic initiates generally conform to the letter of Mohammedan orthodoxy. Occasionally, however, the work they had to do could be done only by crossing into open defiance of official dogma. For this reason, there were Sufi martyrs to Islam, as later there were Western martyrs to the Inquisition. One such was Mansur el-Hallaj, 858–922, who emphasized the importance of Jesus as a member of the chain of initiates. He spoke the Sufi secret, "I am the truth." And for his heresy against orthodoxy, he was dismembered alive by the Muslim Inquisition, Caliphate of el-Muqtadir. As he died, he prayed for mercy for his murderers. It would seem that the very first aim of the Iberian operation was the injection of an intellectual component into the soul stuff of Europe, an action which is reverberating in waves of increasing amplitude to this day. The second was the injection of a modality for which there is no generic term in English at all. Secular religion might be the closest suggestive description. The twin vehicles of this were what would now be called Freemasonry and Illuminism, impulses which at their seventh harmonic were to encompass the French Revolution. The third aim was to introduce a new and subtler shade to the concept of love. The fourth was to provide a psychokinetic technique whereby certain individuals, working perhaps in pairs, could increase their level of conscious energy. The fifth was an action to obtain an immediate development in respect of a few exceptional individuals who would serve as transmitters. To increase intellectual and philosophical speculation, the chief instrument was probably mathematics. Another was the open publication of the Kabbalah. Illuminism was injected into the European consciousness from the school of Ibn Masara, 883–931, in Cordoba, traced by Professor Assin. From the experiences to which Masara's pupils were given access, they were able to glimpse the heights to which human consciousness could aspire. Ripples from this school were to coalesce in the allegories of Dante, the work of the Augustinian scholastics, the theology of Duns Scotus, the science of Roger Bacon, and the reluctant ecclesiastic recognition of the blessed Raymond Lully. The love theme, which was to soften and enhance the harshness of European life for centuries to come, was introduced through the troubadour movement, though the primary intention here was probably to restore a defective feminine element which had been lost in Pauline Christianity. It produced the curious tangential effect of creating the cult of the Virgin Mary, which today is usually assumed to be Christian from its beginnings. But memories are short. The dogma of Mary's Immaculate Conception, for instance, was only proclaimed an article of faith by Pope Pius IX in 1854. To provide a technique which would enable individual men who were ordinary, or almost so, to work towards achieving a decisive rise in the level of their own conscious energy, alchemy was given out. And to provide quickly men able to serve as transmitters, a few exceptional individuals were developed rapidly in the Cordoba and Toledo schools, and sent out into the social, political, and religious streams of Europe. One undoubted example of the latter category was Gerbert of Aurillac, born in Auvergne in 940. Gerbert was a forceful character in his early days, if there is anything veridical at all in the account given of him by William of Malmesbury in the Gesta Regum Angelorum. According to William, Gerbert was a fugitive monk of Fleury, by whom the ordinary arts, arithmetic, music, and astronomy were lapped up as inferior to his genius. He fled to Spain, stole a codex, conscious of the whole art, from under his master's pillow, with help apparently from the master's daughter, fled and was pursued. The direction of his flight, according to William, was betrayed by the stars. So Gerbert hung himself under a bridge between earth, air, and water, thus putting the stars out of their reckoning. Gerbert then invoked the devil and was assisted by him across the Bay of Biscay. He returned to France and became Scholasticus of Reims, where Otto, the future emperor of Germany, Robert Capet, soon to be king of France, and Fulbert, the future bishop of Chartres, were his pupils. Gerbert constructed a water organ and a clock, as well as a brazen head which solved mathematical problems for him. Otto made him bishop of Ravenna and afterwards pope. So did he urge his fortunes, the devil aiding him, that nothing whichever he planned was left imperfect. What does seem to be known about Gerbert, outside William of Malmesbury's imagination, is that he secretly withdrew from his monastery of Fleury in Burgundy and spent some years in a Sufi school at Cordoba or Toledo. He emerged speaking Arabic and in some way transformed. If there is any doubt about the source from which Gerbert received his teaching, the following story would seem to give a very clear pointer. According to William again, the treasure of the Caesars lay buried in the Campus Martius beneath a statue with an outstretched arm that said, "Percuta hic," strike here. Many men struck the arm and went away disbelieving. Gerbert, however, watched and noted where the shadow of the outstretched finger fell at noon. He marked the place and came back at night alone with his chamberlain and a lantern and pick. Where he struck, the earth opened, and they went down into a great hall where a king and queen of gold sat feasting with golden servitors. Light streamed from an enormous gem in the roof of the cavern, and in a corner Gerbert saw a boy with a bow and arrow ready to shoot. Gerbert forbore to touch anything, but his chamberlain, overcome with greed, picked up a golden knife. In an instant, the golden boy shot his arrow, broke the gem, and destroyed the light. With masonry toppling all round them, Gerbert seized the knife from the chamberlain, threw it back into the cavern, and the pair made their escape. Apart from some elaboration about the nature of the treasures, this story related about Gerbert is familiar from another source. In its simpler version, it says briefly, "For centuries, an ancient Egyptian statue, which was reputed to indicate the position of a hidden treasure, baffled all attempts to find it. It was the figure of a man with one hand and finger outstretched. All seekers, except one, tried to find the hoard in the direction in which the finger pointed. The one dug at the spot where the shadow of the finger rested at midday. He found the treasure." Where does this story come from? It is traditionally attributed to Abulfaz Dhul Nun, who died in 860. And who was Dhul Nun? He was a Sufi teacher, third in succession after David of Tai, died 781, and Maruf Kaki, died 815, of the Sufi school of the builders. In modern Freemasonry, the celebrated Masonic word Boaz is said to be Al-Boaz, a corruption of Dhul Nun's first name, Abulfaz. The Sufic origin of Gerbert's course of instruction could hardly be more clearly indicated. The Sufic origin of Freemasonry is also strongly suggested. Every legend about Gerbert has one idea in common. He was not an ordinary man. The invention of machines of one kind or another is in line with the exceptional mechanical talents of the Weltmensch from Pythagoras to Leonardo. But the legend of the brass head, which could answer questions, is another matter altogether. Perhaps because one French church history took William of Malmesbury too literally, this head of brass has been taken as an actual mechanical contrivance, and it has been seized upon by modern computer engineers in search of their own ancestors. More than one modern cybernetic expert has suggested that Gerbert, or Sylvester Terkand as he became when elected Pope, invented the world's first binary computer. In Computers and Automation, 1954, the following appears. "We must suppose that he, Sylvester, possessed an extraordinary knowledge and the most remarkable skill and inventiveness. This speaking head must have been fashioned under a certain conjunction of stars, occurring at the exact moment when all the planets were starting on their course. In fact, Sylvester is by no means the only medieval figure to have had this kind of binary computer. Robert of Lincoln, Robert Grosseteste, had one. So had Albertus Magnus. Albert took 30 years to make his. In Valentine and Orson, an old French romance connected with the Alexander cycle, there is another legend of a brazen head. This one told all who consulted it everything they sought to know. It was kept in a castle in Portugal and was the property of a giant named Tarango. Giant is one of these key words like brass, gold, and light, which we shall find cropping up over and over again. Like the other words, giant may have a meaning vastly different from its apparent one. The Templars also were supposed to have a head which was all-wise, and in consequence they, like Gerbert Sylvester, were linked with the devil. In modern times, C.S. Lewis has contributed a story of remarkable power in which the head idea is the central theme. Here, however, the head is probably at its lowest level of understanding in all literature. It is the severed head of a criminal which has been revitalized so that it makes contact with extraterrestrial evil, symbolized as macrobes, roughly equivalent to the ultimate evil which endlessly obsessed H.P. Lovecraft. Looked at from a slightly less material level, the gradations of heads in esoteric legend, they are of different metals, are strangely similar to the gradations through which the philosopher's stone is purified in alchemy. There may also be similarity with the gradations of color in a red Indian chief's headdress. Could it be that Sylvester's head of brass refers to a non-material head that Sylvester had made by his own efforts? This head was able to answer infallibly because the substance of which it was made was coextensive with an energy level containing the answers to all questions which can arise in time. There might be support for such an idea in very recent times. The Indonesian mystic Pak Subu has more than once referred to the fact that at a certain level of development a man needs no knowledge at all, in the ordinary intellectual sense. He implies that it is possible to have access to a level at which answer and question exist together as a one-to-one correspondence. Here there is a clear link with the binary computer idea which has so fascinated cybernetic historians looking for their own origins in an early but exceptionally talented pope. It is certainly not without relevance that the methodology of Subud, the cult which regards Paksubu as its leader, has been identified with a Sufic Naqshbandi origin. Of possible further relevance is the statement of a modern Sufi master, Ahmad Mustafa Sarmuni, to a Western investigator. Faced with two possibilities, you spend time and effort to decide which to accept. You review the whole spectrum of political, emotional, social, physical, psychological, and physiological conditioning before coming up with the answer, which more often than not does not satisfy you even then. Do you know, can you comprehend what freedom it gives you if you have no choice? The choice that you make, your decision, is based upon such positive knowledge that the second alternative might as well not exist. We suggest that the brazen head of Sylvester, like all the other heads that have worried people from the early Middle Ages till the present time, was a head of a symbolic kind, the nature of which has been suggested in the foregoing paragraph. Yet if Gerbert did possess some higher faculty, it does not seem that he fulfilled his potential. With his rise to the papacy, a very great possibility surely existed, that the Directorate would be able to work within the Christian Church from the top down to restore the elements which had been lost or discarded in the involution of the first millennium. It may be that Gerbert failed some high hope that had been vested in him. Certainly it would seem that after him, the Directorate had to begin a long process of infiltrating developmental trends into the Church from the bottom up instead of from the papal throne down. Let us suppose for a moment that the head of brass symbolizes the regeneration of man to a certain level. Suppose that it means regeneration in terms of will at the level of the individual, and therefore impure self. Above this, there would be another level, based on supra-self, for which a head of gold might be the symbol. Perhaps the process of opening a man to consciousness is one of the most perilous that can occur in nature. A very deep insight in this direction has been offered by a writer of the 19th century. If you seek a finite end first, that is, before you seek the universal, the kingdom of God, which you are ordered to do, you have to give up the finite ends at every stage. All sorts of gifts are offered. You may stop in any of them, but if you do, you commit idolatry. If the human will creates itself into an entity, there is the second death. A miserable existence is created and made permanent. We were made mortal in order to save us from that. If the immortality is made in the self-will, it is contrary to the universal will, and the result is a wrathful, biting life. An almost identical insight is conveyed in the system of the first, second, and third degree Hasnamus individuals described by G.I. Gurdjieff. If Gerbert did not submit his head of brass to the alchemical process which transforms it to the head of gold, but used the level he had obtained for the gratification of his self-will, then he betrayed the Directorate, and incidentally condemned himself to an infra-immortality which is the substance of every legend of hell. Such a situation, if sensed by Gerbert's contemporaries, would be described in the only symbolism available at the time. He had sold his soul to the devil. It may be significant that the school which derived from Sylvester produced Benedict IX, noted for his profligacy, Lawrence Archbishop of Malfi, John V, and Gregory IV, all reputed to be sorcerers. In none of these men does it seem possible to catch even a glimpse of the spiritual radiance which surrounds the smallest action of the Sufi masters, and it may be that in general the Directorate has not been justified of her European children. At the same time, it is wholly wrong to attempt to evaluate such matters from their externals. It may be that certain of the later Adeptus transformations can be achieved only against the friction set up by the deliberate creation of an environment of opprobrium and abuse. It is interesting in this connection to note that Gerbert was connected with the school of Dhul Nun. Dhul Nun was the founder of the Order of the Malamati, which is also known as the Order of the Blameworthy. Incurring blame and opprobrium can be required of a man as part of a developmental process. The smallest activity of the Directorate can be likened to an iceberg. Only 1/9, perhaps 1/99, is ever visible. All the rest is unseen and, over many centuries of history, quite unsuspected.